Hi, this is Mike from Minimal 3DP, and today I'm going to go over installing the firmware for BigtreeTech's TFT35 version 3 touchscreen. This should actually be the same set of instructions used for a variety of the BigtreeTech screens. And then once I've installed the firmware on the screen, I'm also going to show how to go through and the various settings that need to be adjusted in the Marlin firmware, as well as a plugin that can be installed in Cura so you can have thumbnail displays of your slice if you use Cura and you are printing off the SD card. Before we get started, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. What I'm going to do is, rather than use the command line in Git, which is my preferred method for dealing with GitHub repositories, I'm going to do everything via GitHub Desktop, which I think is more accessible for regular users. To install GitHub Desktop, you're going to go to the GitHub Desktop website and go ahead and download and install the program. I'm not going to go over installing GitHub Desktop step by step. I'll let you go ahead and do that yourself. So moving forward, we're going to assume you have GitHub Desktop installed. Once we have GitHub Desktop installed, we're going to navigate over to the BigtreeTech GitHub repository for the touchscreen firmware. So here is the repository for the touchscreen. And if you scroll down, this firmware is not just for the TFT version 3, it's for a variety of BigtreeTech touchscreens. With that said, these same instructions should be of use no matter what touchscreen you're using. Before we continue, I'd like to point out a couple of inconsistencies with the Firmware Repository, just so you don't get confused, because I myself found this a little bit confusing. Up at the top here, it has the current release is from April 10th, 2021. One of the key things you have to do here is move files from this folder onto your SD card for installation. As you can see, most of these files were updated 2 days ago, so this is a more current version of the software. At least it's been updated in the past couple of days. Also, some of the themes have, at least according to this, something's been updated within the past 2 months. Now, in doing a review of all the documentation, it actually says down here to ignore the other branches, and they're not to be used, so you're supposed to use the master branch. So what I'm going to do is just use the master branch. So you have two choices when dealing with a repository such as this. You can create a clone of it, or you can create a fork. A fork allows you to basically be working on a copy of the code. So I tend to like to do a fork. So what I'm going to do is just click the fork button, select my username in GitHub, and this should take a couple minutes to create that fork. And there, it's finished. Next, I want to go ahead and get this code to my machine. So I'm going to go ahead and click Code, and then open with GitHub Desktop, and then hit open with GitHub Desktop again. So once I'm in GitHub Desktop, here's the repository, the touchscreen firmware repository that I'm cloning down to my machine, and here's where I'm storing it. It's already storing it in my code folder, so that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and hit clone. As you can see, this is copying files down to my machine. And this takes a couple minutes. Once it's completed, copy it to my machine. This dialog comes up. For right now, I'm just going to click for my own purposes and hit continue. So right now, the current repository is the BigtreeTech touchscreen firmware, and it's on branch master. So that's exactly what I want it looking like. Now if I go over, I can check this in my File Explorer. So in my File Explorer, you'll notice that here is the BigtreeTech touchscreen firmware folder on my machine. So that's perfect. Now if I want to sync this back with pull changes from BigtreeTech, if they ever add them into the changes I've made, I just need to go over to GitHub desktop, make sure I'm on the big screen touchscreen, make sure I'm on the correct branch, and then click branch, merge into current branch, and then scroll down and select upstream master. And if there's any change, they'll tell me, and if there's again changes, I can hit this button and they'll pull them in. So you can use that to make sure you stay up to date. Something else you want to do if there's already changes on GitHub that you don't have here is I always, before I start, do a repository pull. So that way, again, make sure everything that's on my machine is the most current. To get started with the update process, I'm going to navigate over to the touchscreen firmware folder on my laptop. And I need to copy several files from the copy to SD card root directory folder. So the first file I need is the Bigtree TFT35 version 3 bin file. So I'm going to copy that. I'll copy that and then paste it onto my SD card. Back to the folder, I need this config ini. Let me move that last. So we'll go over the language packs here, and let's grab the English pack, copy, and paste that here onto my SD card. Now, I mentioned the config ini and said I was going to wait on that. Let's go over and look at the browser and look at the various options we have. With the GitHub repository open in the browser, I'm going to scroll down and look at some of these settings. Scroll down. First thing we have is I can have this info box either enabled or disabled, and that's done via the config.ini file. And then also various themes. I personally like this info box, so let's check the config.ini file. Setting we're looking at is status screen, so I'm going to copy that here. And then I've opened the ini file in my text editor. And I'm going to go ahead and do a find. Okay, and that option is already enabled, so the info screen will show up. Now, I also want to make a change. I know from experience that the move icons for the Z-axis on the Ender 5 Plus, which I'm using, are going to be backwards. So the move button that is pointing up, and let me switch over and show you on the actual screen. Okay, so if I'm looking at the screen here, move the the two Z buttons are actually backwards because of how the bed moves on the Ender 5 Plus. So I need to go ahead and make another change in the ini file that's specific to the Ender 5 Plus. I'm sure all Ender 5s or and similar machines where the bed moves in a similar manner. So going back to my text editor, down here under inverted axes, I want to go ahead and edit the z-axis, be z1, and that'll invert it so the buttons are pointing in the right direction. So I want to go ahead and save this config file. So this config.ini, I've made my update. I'm going to go ahead and close my text editor. And let's go back over to my file folders. So since I've made my change, I'm going to copy the ini file, copy it, and then paste it over onto my SD card. So now I have the bin file, the ini, and the language file. Last thing I need to do is I want to do a theme on my display. So let's go look at the browser. So in the browser, again on the repository website, there's a couple different themes: a unified theme, rounded miracle theme, hybrid red material, hybrid mono material, and then a riprap dark. Right now, I'm previously using this round material theme. Let me go and just so that way it looks different once we update it, I'm going to do the unified menu theme. So I want to go back over to our file folders, and let's go on my machine, and I want the unified menu material theme. So let's go into that folder. I want to copy the TFT35, and let's go ahead and paste that into my SD card. So now I'm going to eject the SD card, move it from my machine, and I'm going to go ahead and plug it in to the TFT. Now, as you can see, there's the old theme. So let's turn the machine off, and let's turn it on again, and it should start the update process right away. Now it's copying the files around, and this will take several minutes. I apologize if the video isn't crystal clear here, but I'll try to walk you through it. This initial step right now, it's copying over the fonts. And this takes about 3 or 4 minutes, at least on my machine. So this is copying over now. And we have, I think, 5 different steps here. So it's initial step where it's loading the data, a second step where it's doing the fonts. Then it will switch over to the icons, the config file, and then lastly the languages. So while this is going, let me show you a couple things in the browser here. Now, down here, once this is done copying, I keep scrolling here till I find this. Maybe it's up here towards the top. There's a bunch of settings that actually need to be changed in Marlin to fully use the firmware. The firmware on the screen. Let's go back over. Right now, it's copying over the individual images. And at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice 2 things. There's an upload with a count as it's uploading individual images, and then also a count for items that were not uploaded. In my case, right now I have 0 have not been uploaded, which is good. And I've done this several times now, and I don't think I've seen a case where something's not been uploaded. Now, again, I apologize for this not being crystal clear. It turns out during the install process you can't adjust the brightness of the screen. Or I can adjust it once I have it going. Now it's just update the config. Now lastly, we're doing the language. And let me fix this so you can see the brightness. Okay, and hopefully you can see the icons and the screen has been updated. So now our firmware on the TFT itself has been updated. And let's go ahead and check all the settings in Marlin and make those updates. Okay, so I've opened up VS Code, and now what I'm going to do is go through and make all the changes in the config.h file. And there's several I need to do. So the first thing we want to do is in VS Code, the first thing we want to do is let's start running finds so we can find these. So I want to make sure EEPROM settings is enabled. Next, SD support is enabled. Next, we need to enable nozzle park feature. Let's search for that. And I'm going to delete 2 slashes to enable it. We need the repeatability test. So we delete all the text up here and paste in zmin probe repeatability test. Again, delete 2 slashes to enable. And we need lastly to do the G26 mesh validation. And delete the 2 slashes to enable that. That should be all our changes in the configuration.h file. Now let's switch over to configuration advanced.h. So the first setting, we want to make sure baby stepping is enabled. So I want to again search for that. So it's enabled. I have several reports I want to enable. So make sure auto report temperatures is enabled. Also, auto report position needs to be enabled. We need to enable M115. This is 115 geometry report is enabled. Same for M114. Enabled. Good. And we'll be able to report fan changes. Enabled. Good. Good. Enable long file name support. That's enabled. We want auto report SD status. It's enabled. We want to make sure it's right down here. Yeah, there it is. SD card underscore connection set to onboard. Emergency parser is enabled. Serial float precision needs to be set to 4. and that's enabled and set to 4. Host action commands. And again, all this is doing is setting up so all the functions on the TFT will work with Marlin. So define host action commands. Now, several of these I had enabled in the past for other reasons. So make sure on your firmware you go through and check everything. Now the TFT, I should also mention, will work without making these changes, but I just want to make sure that all the functions work. So fine, host prompt support is enabled, and now we have to make a couple changes to get the load and unload menu to work. So advanced pause features enabled. Park head on pause right here needs to be enabled. Film and unload G codes needs to be enabled. And one of the last ones listed, or the last one listed, is this one. Let me show it to you. Is this Z-stepper auto align. I have both my Z-steppers, both of my steppers going to one slot on the on my card in my machine. If I used two different slots, Z1, Z0, or what is it, Z1 and Z2, then I need to go ahead and enable this. For me, I don't need this enabled. So I'm just going to leave that disabled, and I'm going to save. I want to make sure that, in my case on my Mac, there's usually a little white dot if something's not saved. Both the config and the config advanced are both saved. In my configuration.h, I'm going to scroll up to the top, and in this line here, custom machine name, I always try to keep track of changes I've made, so I'm going to change that to, let's change that 2.1.0. I'm going to save that. Now, to compile this, I use an extension called Auto Build Marlin in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to hit Show ABM Panel. Now, I've already had a build I did earlier today. I want to go ahead and hit Clean and let that delete all the files that are hanging out on my machine that I don't need anymore. Now, I'm using the BigtreeTech SKR2, the F29 version. I'm going to go down here in my terminal window. I'm just going to type in clear. So that way it's starting fresh. And so I want to go ahead on this BigtreeTech SKR2 F429 and hit build. Now hopefully if I've done everything correctly, this will build appropriately. So let me pause and I'll switch back over once it's finished. Okay, this is configured violation. And there's a success down here at the bottom. I can go ahead and click on the firmware.bin, and if I switch over, it's opened it in my Finder. I can go ahead and copy that firmware, and I'll move over to my SD card. I'm going to delete firmware.cur, which was the last one I did, and paste in the new firmware.bin. Paste that in. I'm going to eject, and then let me switch back over to the printer. I'm going to put the SD card in, turn the machine off, turn it back on. Right now my screen says no printer attached, so it's working. And if I look down here at the bottom, let's go to Menu, Settings, Information. And there it is. In this it says the 2.1, which I just installed. You also notice that for the TFT, it's from April 2nd, 2022. That's perfect. Now we're going to do one other thing I like to do. So let's go back to Settings, Machine, EEPROM, and let's go ahead and reset that. And that way we can set this machine up from scratch. So that's the process for updating the firmware on the screen, and then also enabling all the functions via Marlin. This video went much longer than I planned, so I'll do a separate video on how to get Cura thumbnails to show up on the screen. Hopefully you found this helpful. Again, this is Mike from Minimal 3DP. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If you like what I'm doing and like this content, please subscribe, and also if you like the video, please give me a like. I appreciate your time. Have a good night.